This is HOA. Karen gets denied. I did not raise my voice, I raised my evidence packet. My name is Derek. I am a court runner who files documents and knows deadlines, and the woman screaming at me from 6 feet away is about to make the worst mistake of her HOA career. "You are going to tear that fence out today," she shouts, jabbing her finger toward the half-installed cedar panels behind me. I stare at her, clipboard in hand, scarf flapping in the October wind like a flag of war. "The fence is 4 inches over the setback line," she continues, "and you never submitted the revised survey addendum to the Architectural Review Subcommittee." I take a breath and pull out my phone. "I have the approved permit right here," I say calmly, "and the survey was filed 6 weeks ago." She smirks and taps her clipboard with a clear rain cover. "I do not care what you think you filed," she says. "You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." That is Virginia Ramirez, Fines and Enforcement Coordinator for the cottages at Willow Glen Reserve Association, and she has been waiting for me to slip up since the day I moved to Syracuse 3 years ago. I took this house because the rent was reasonable and the commute to the courthouse downtown was 10 minutes. I needed stability because I share custody of my daughter, and I cannot risk missing custody or visitation time because of HOA hearings and delays. The neighborhood looked quiet, tree-lined, normal. What I did not know was that the cottages at Willow Glen Reserve Association operated like a private fiefdom, and Virginia ran enforcement like a collections agency with a grudge. The trouble started 2 months ago when my contractor, a guy named Luis who has been doing fences in Syracuse for 15 years, accidentally tracked some dirt onto the sidewalk while hauling materials. It was a smudge, barely visible, gone after one rain. But Virginia saw it, took photos, and sent me a violation notice the same day. The notice claimed the dirt was evidence of unpermitted construction and fined me $250 for environmental degradation and unapproved contractor access. I called the management company and explained that I had submitted my fence application in July, received written approval in August, and hired Luis in September. The management company said they would look into it. A week later, I received another notice. This one said my fence work had proceeded without final survey verification and that I owed an additional $500 for non-compliance. When I tried to pay the first fine to avoid late fees, the HOA refused my payment and said they were reviewing my account for escalation. Then they charged me a late fee for the payment they refused. That was the moment I realized this was not about rules. This was about control. Virginia is in her mid-50s, black hair pulled into a tight bun, always wearing her red baseball cap and a pink windbreaker no matter the weather. She carries a small collapsible step stool everywhere, the kind you would use to reach a high shelf, and she uses it to measure fence heights, gutter angles, mailbox posts, anything she can cite. I have seen her pull that step stool out at least a dozen times, always with the same theatrical flourish, like she is about to expose a crime. The first time I saw her use it was last spring when she climbed up to inspect my neighbor's porch railing and declared it half an inch too tall. The neighbor, a retired teacher named Ed, ended up paying a carpenter $300 to shave the rail down. Ed told me later that Virginia had measured from the wrong side of the post, but by then the fine was paid and the work was done. That is how it works here. You pay, you comply, you move on, or you end up on Virginia's list. But I could not move on, because my daughter's schedule depends on me being present and reliable, and I could not afford to waste time fighting HOA nonsense every week. So I started keeping records. I saved every email, every notice, every receipt. I made copies of my permit application, my survey, my contractor's license, my payment attempts. I kept a folder in my truck with everything organized by date. I also started paying attention to Virginia's patterns. She showed up at my house every Thursday around 5:30, right when I was getting home from work. She always parked across the street and watched, clipboard in hand, scarf flapping, waiting for something she could cite. I realized she was not just enforcing rules. She was hunting. 3 weeks ago, Luis and I started the actual fence installation. The old fence was rotting, leaning, a safety hazard. I had gotten 3 quotes, picked Luis because he knew the local codes, and filed every form the HOA required. The application included a site plan, a materials list, a timeline, and a signed copy of the updated survey I had commissioned in June. The survey showed my property line clearly marked with stakes and string, and the fence design matched the setback requirements in the HOA covenants. I even had the surveyor sign a certification letter stating that the fence would be compliant. I submitted everything to the Architectural Review Committee in July. In August, I received an approval letter from the management company on behalf of the HOA board. I thought I was covered. But the day Louise started digging post holes, Virginia appeared. She marched across the street, stepped over the string line we had set up to mark the fence alignment, and demanded to see the permit. I showed her the approval letter on my phone. She squinted at it, shook her head, and said the letter was invalid because it did not include a final inspection waiver. I had never heard of a final inspection waiver. I checked the covenants that night and found no mention of it. I emailed the management company and asked if such a document existed. They replied 2 days later and said no, it did not. By then, Virginia had already filed a stop work complaint and sent me a notice threatening immediate legal action if I continued construction. The notice also included a new fine, $800, for unauthorized excavation. I was furious, but I kept working. Luis and I knew the survey was solid, and I was not going to let Virginia's invented rules stop me from fixing a fence that needed replacing. That decision turned out to be the right one, but it cost me. Over the next 10 days, Virginia escalated. She sent an email blast to the entire neighborhood framing me as the one resident who refuses community standards, claiming I was ignoring HOA authority and putting property values at risk. The email included photos of my yard mid-construction, dirt piles, tools, fence panels stacked against the old posts. It made the project look chaotic and reckless, even though it was a standard fence replacement. I started getting cold stares from neighbors when I picked up my mail. One guy, a real estate agent named Brad, stopped me in the driveway and said he hoped I knew what I was doing, because Virginia does not lose. I told him I had proof, and he laughed. He said proof does not matter if the board is on her side. The board hearing was scheduled for today, a Friday afternoon at 4, and if I missed it, they planned to default vote against me and authorize the HOA to remove the fence at my expense. Virginia had made sure the hearing was scheduled during my work hours, knowing I would have to choose between showing up and keeping my job. But I planned ahead. I asked my supervisor for the afternoon off, told him I had a family emergency, and he gave me the time. I was not going to let Virginia win by default. I also knew I had something she did not expect. A trump card. I stared at the violation letter the night before the hearing and smiled, because it proved exactly what I suspected. Virginia had been lying about the property line for months, and I had the proof. The trump card was a gate access audit log. The Cottages at Willow Glen Reserve Association has a gated entrance with keycard access, and every entry and exit is logged by the system. I had requested my access history 2 months ago as part of a separate dispute about guest parking, and the management company sent me a full report. What I found in that report was shocking. My access had been deliberately blocked 3 times in August, always on days when I had scheduled contractor meetings or deliveries. The blockages were not technical glitches. They were manual overrides, and the system logs showed the override commands came from an administrative account tied to the HOA enforcement office. In other words, Virginia had been locking me out of my own neighborhood to sabotage my project. I also cross-referenced the logs with the dates on the violation notices she had sent me, and the pattern was clear. Every time she blocked my access, she filed a new complaint within hours, claiming I was not cooperating or that my contractor was trespassing. It was a setup. I did not tell anyone about the logs. I kept them in my truck, printed and highlighted, along with the rest of my evidence. I wanted to use them at the right moment, when Virginia could not deflect or spin the story. I knew she would try to dominate the hearing, and I needed something that would shut her down cold. The problem was that the hearing was not the only threat I faced. 2 days ago, Virginia escalated again. She showed up at my house with 2 other board members, a guy named Rick who works in insurance and a woman named Paula who I had never met. They walked onto my property without permission, stepped over the new fence line, and started taking measurements with a tape measure and a level. I came outside and asked what they were doing. Virginia said they were conducting an emergency compliance inspection and that I was required to cooperate. I told her she was trespassing and that she needed to leave. She smiled, pulled out her phone, and started recording. She said she was documenting my refusal to comply and that the video would be used as evidence at the hearing. Rick and Paula stood behind her, silent, holding the tape measure like props in a staged scene. I realized she was trying to bait me into a reaction, something she could use to paint me as hostile or uncooperative. I did not take the bait. I pulled out my own phone, started recording, and said I was calling the police to report a trespass. She laughed and said the police would not come for an HOA dispute. Then, she repeated her favorite line, the one she had used on me at least twice before. "You signed the covenants," she said. "Now you live the covenants." That was a mistake, because I recorded the whole thing, and she did not realize how that line would sound to a neutral audience. I also recorded her saying something even worse. Right before she left, she turned to Rick and Paula and said, "Loud enough for my phone to pick up, I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." It was a threat, clear and direct, and it confirmed what I had suspected. Virginia was not enforcing rules. She was punishing people she did not like. I spent the next day preparing for the hearing. I printed copies of the access logs, the survey, the approval letter, the violation notices, and the video transcript. I also reached out to an ally I had made a few weeks earlier, a community mail carrier named Janet, who had witnessed Virginia posting notices on my door repeatedly, sometimes 2 or 3 times in 1 week. Janet had told me she thought Virginia was obsessed, and she agreed to write a short witness statement describing what she had seen. Janet is careful and professional, and she did not want to get involved in HOA drama, but she said she would help if it meant stopping someone from abusing their authority. Her statement was 1 page, simple and factual, and it corroborated my timeline. I added it to my folder. The other complication I faced was a neighbor named Greg, a retired engineer who lived 2 doors down. Greg had started measuring property lines on his own after Virginia filed a complaint against him for a mailbox placement issue last year. Greg is smart, methodical, and obsessed with accuracy, but he made one critical error. He measured from the wrong survey marker, an old wooden stake that had been placed by a previous owner and never updated. Greg's measurements showed that several fences in the neighborhood, including mine, were over the line. He shared his findings on the neighborhood email list and included a hand-drawn map with annotations. The map was confusing and full of bad math, but it spread fast, and suddenly half the neighbors thought I was the problem. I tried to explain that Greg had used the wrong reference point, but by then the damage was done. Virginia seized on Greg's map and used it as evidence in her email blast, claiming it proved I was violating the setback. I knew I would have to debunk Greg's math at the hearing, and that meant I needed the real survey in hand. The hearing was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the entrance gate with a conference room and a kitchenette. I arrived 15 minutes early and set up my folder on the table. The room smelled like stale coffee and lemon cleaner. The board members filed in one by one. Rick, the insurance guy, looked uncomfortable. Paula, the silent witness from the trespass scene, avoided eye contact. The board president, a man in his 60s named Tom, sat at the head of the table and shuffled papers. Virginia sat to his right, clipboard in hand, scarf draped over the back of her chair, step stool folded neatly beside her feet. She looked calm, confident, like she had already won. I sat across from them and waited. Tom opened the hearing by reading the complaint. He said I was accused of constructing a fence that violated HOA setback requirements, ignored stop work orders, and refused to cooperate with compliance inspections. He asked if I wanted to respond. I said I did. I pulled out the approval letter and slid it across the table. "This is the written approval I received from the management company in August," I said. "It confirms that my fence design meets all HOA requirements." Virginia did not even look at it. She said the approval was conditional and that I had failed to provide the final documentation. I asked what documentation she meant. She said I needed a signed affidavit from the surveyor confirming that the fence posts were placed exactly on the line shown in the survey. I said that was not in the covenants and not in the approval letter. She said it was an administrative requirement. I asked her to show me where that requirement was written. She did not answer. Instead, she pulled out Greg's hand-drawn map and said it proved my fence was over the line. I took a breath and pulled out the real survey. I placed it on the table next to Greg's map. "This is the certified survey I commissioned in June," I said. "It was prepared by a licensed surveyor, stamped and filed with the county. It shows my property line clearly, and my fence is within the setback by 6 inches. Virginia glanced at the survey and said surveys can be manipulated. I said that was not how surveys work. Tom looked uncomfortable. He asked Virginia if she had any proof that my survey was wrong. She said she had measurements taken during the emergency inspection. I said those measurements were taken without my consent during a trespass onto my property, and I had video evidence to prove it. That got their attention. I played the video on my phone. The audio was clear. Virginia's voice saying I can put you on the agenda and keep you there. The board members shifted in their seats. Paula looked at the floor. Rick cleared his throat. Tom asked Virginia if that was her voice. She said it was taken out of context. I said the context was that she had trespassed onto my property with 2 board members, taken measurements without permission, and threatened to keep me on the agenda indefinitely as retaliation. Tom asked if I had filed a police report. I said I had not, but I could. Virginia stood up, face flushed, and said this was a waste of time. She said I was trying to distract from the real issue, which was that my fence was non-compliant. I said the real issue was that she had been harassing me for months, blocking my gate access, refusing my payments, and inventing rules that did not exist. Then I pulled out the gate access logs. I slid them across the table. "These are the access logs from the HOA gate system," I said. "They show that my keycard access was manually blocked 3 times in August, always on days when I had contractor deliveries scheduled. The overrides came from the enforcement office." I looked directly at Virginia. "You locked me out of my own neighborhood," I said, "so you could file complaints claiming my contractor was trespassing. You sabotaged my project, and then you fined me for the delays you caused." The room went silent. Virginia opened her mouth, closed it, and sat back down. Tom picked up the logs and read them. He looked at Virginia and asked if she had access to the gate system. She said she did, but she had never blocked anyone's access. I said the logs showed otherwise, and the management company could verify them. Rick leaned forward and said this was serious. Paula asked if there were logs for other residents. I said I did not know, but if Virginia had done this to me, she had probably done it to others. Tom said he would contact the management company immediately and request a full audit. Virginia tried to interrupt, but Tom cut her off. He said the hearing was adjourned pending the audit, and that no action would be taken against my fence until the matter was resolved. I stood up, gathered my papers, and walked out. Virginia stayed in her seat, staring at the table, scarf draped over the chair like a surrender flag. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama. 2 days later, the management company released the audit results. The gate access system had been tampered with 47 times over the past year, and 32 of those overrides were linked to Virginia's administrative account. The overrides targeted 9 different residents, all of whom had been fined for contractor access violations, delivery delays, or non-compliance. The pattern was undeniable. Virginia had been using the gate system as a weapon, locking people out and then punishing them for the delays she caused. The management company issued a formal apology to all affected residents and announced that they would be conducting a full review of the enforcement process. They also suspended Virginia's access to the gate system and removed her from her position as fines and enforcement coordinator pending a disciplinary review. The board scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss next steps. I was invited to attend. The emergency meeting was held the following Monday. The clubhouse was packed. At least 20 residents showed up, some of whom I had never spoken to before. They all had stories. A woman named Lisa said Virginia had fined her $600 for parking her car on the street overnight during a family emergency. A man named Carlos said Virginia had blocked his contractor from entering the neighborhood for 3 days, forcing him to cancel a roof repair and pay a cancellation fee. Another resident, a woman named Kim, said Virginia had threatened to put a lien on her house over a dispute about a garden gnome. The stories kept coming, and the anger in the room was palpable. Tom opened the meeting by apologizing on behalf of the board. He said they had been unaware of the extent of Virginia's actions, and that they took full responsibility for failing to oversee her. He also announced that the board was recommending Virginia's immediate removal from all leadership roles, and that they would be working with the management company to implement new oversight protocols. Then he asked if anyone wanted to speak. I stood up. I said I appreciated the apology, but an apology was not enough. I said the board had allowed Virginia to operate without accountability for years, and that the damage she had caused went beyond fines and gate access. I said she had created a culture of fear and retaliation, and that residents were afraid to speak up because they did not want to end up on her list. I said the board needed to do more than remove Virginia. They needed to commit to transparency, regular audits, and a formal complaint process that protected residents from abuse. I also said I was prepared to file a formal complaint with the State Consumer Protection Office if the board did not take immediate action. The room erupted in applause. Tom looked stunned. Virginia, who was sitting in the back row, stood up and walked out without saying a word. The twist came 3 days later. I was going through the meeting minutes from the past year, trying to understand how Virginia had been able to operate unchecked for so long, when I noticed something strange. The minutes from the August board meeting, the one where my fence application was supposedly approved, had been edited after the meeting. The original file, which I had requested from the management company as part of my records request, showed that the board had approved my application with no conditions. But the version posted on the HOA website included a note stating that approval was conditional pending final survey verification. The note was added 2 weeks after the meeting, and the edit was logged under Virginia's user account. She had altered the minutes to create a fake requirement, and then used that fake requirement to justify her enforcement actions. I forwarded the evidence to Tom and the management company immediately. The management company confirmed the tampering and referred the matter to their legal team. Tom called me that evening and said the board was meeting the next day to discuss legal action against Virginia. He also said they would be issuing a formal retraction of all fines and violations she had issued over the past year. I asked if that included my fines. He said yes, all of them, and that I would receive a full refund. The final showdown happened the following Saturday. Virginia had called an impromptu meeting at the curbside by the community entrance sign, no readable text, where the fence materials were still staged for my project. She sent an email to the board and several residents claiming that my fence was still non-compliant and that she had the authority to order its removal under the emergency compliance clause. I was not sure what emergency compliance clause she was talking about, but I knew this was her last stand. She was trying to reassert control before the board could officially remove her. I showed up with Luis, my contractor, and Janet, the mail carrier who had written the witness statement. A small crowd of neighbors gathered, curious to see what would happen. Virginia was standing beside the entrance sign, step stool at her feet, clipboard in hand, scarf flapping in the October wind. She saw me and pointed at the fence. "That fence is coming down today," she said. "I have a work order signed by the board, and if you do not comply, I will have it removed at your expense." I asked to see the work order. She pulled a paper from her clipboard and held it up. I could see it was a blank HOA form with her signature at the bottom. There was no board signature, no date, no approval stamp. I said the work order was fake. She said it was valid. I said I wanted it in writing from the board president with a date and a signature. She said I was stalling. I pulled out my phone and called Tom. He answered immediately. I explained the situation and put him on speaker. Tom told Virginia to stand down and to stop harassing residents. He said she had no authority to issue work orders and that any action she took would be considered unauthorized and potentially criminal. Virginia's face went pale. She tried to argue, but Tom cut her off. He said the board had already voted to remove her from all leadership roles, effective immediately, and that she was no longer permitted to act on behalf of the HOA in any capacity. He also said the management company had referred her conduct to the State Consumer Protection Office and that they were cooperating with the investigation. Virginia dropped the clipboard. It hit the pavement with a sharp crack. She stared at me, and I could see the moment she realized it was over. I did not gloat. I just stood there, phone in hand, and waited for her to leave. She picked up the clipboard, folded her step stool, and walked to her car without another word. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The State Consumer Protection Office opened a case file against the cottages at Willow Glen Reserve Association and Virginia personally, focusing on the gate access tampering, the fraudulent fines, and the altered meeting minutes. The HOA rushed to settle, agreeing to refund all fines Virginia had issued over the past 2 years and to implement new oversight policies. Virginia was forced to resign from every leadership role she held, not just within the HOA, but also from the neighborhood social committee and the community garden board. She tried to fight the resignation, but the board made it clear that if she did not step down voluntarily, they would pursue formal charges for fraud and harassment. She resigned the next day. The management company also disciplined the rep who had enabled Virginia's behavior, a woman named Diane who had repeatedly ignored resident complaints and rubber-stamped Virginia's enforcement actions. Diane was reassigned to a different property, and the HOA hired a new representative who promised to prioritize transparency and accountability. The funny karma moment came 2 weeks later. A resident named Mark, who had been one of Virginia's biggest supporters, filed a complaint against her for a fence violation on his own property. Mark had installed a decorative iron fence around his front yard the previous year, and Virginia had approved it without question because Mark was on her side. But after Virginia was removed, someone pulled the original application and discovered that Mark's fence was 8 inches over the setback, a clear violation of the same rules Virginia had used to target me. The new enforcement coordinator, a calm and professional man named Stephen, sent Mark a polite notice asking him to adjust the fence or apply for a variance. Mark was furious. He demanded a hearing, just like I had, and he showed up with a folder full of paperwork claiming his fence was grandfathered in. Stephen reviewed the application, confirmed the violation, and told Mark he had 30 days to comply or face a fine. Mark tried to argue that Virginia had told him the fence was fine. Stephen said that did not matter because the fence violated the covenants. Mark asked if there were exceptions. Stephen said no. Mark turned to leave, and as he walked out, someone in the hallway repeated Virginia's favorite line. "You signed the covenants," they said. "Now you live the covenants." I was not there, but I heard about it from at least 3 people, and every one of them said it was the most satisfying moment of the year. The board election challenge happened a month later. Several residents, including Lisa, Carlos, and Kim, organized a petition to recall 2 board members who had enabled Virginia's behavior by failing to provide oversight. The petition gathered enough signatures to trigger a special election, and 3 new candidates ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. I did not run myself, but I supported the campaign by sharing my story and encouraging residents to vote. The election was held in early November, and all 3 new candidates won by wide margins. Tom, the board president, kept his seat but announced that he would not seek re-election the following year. The new board immediately passed a resolution requiring quarterly audits of all enforcement actions and establishing a formal appeals process for residents who believed they had been unfairly targeted. They also hired an independent management company to review the HOA's financial records and ensure that fines and fees were being applied consistently. The shift in power was real, and for the first time in years, residents felt like they had a voice. As for me, I finished the fence. Luis and I completed the installation in mid-November, and the final result was exactly what I had planned. Solid cedar panels, clean lines, 6 inches inside the setback, and fully compliant with every rule in the covenants. I submitted the final inspection photos to the new enforcement coordinator, and he approved them within 24 hours. No drama, no delays, no invented requirements. I also received a check from the HOA for the full amount of the fines Virginia had issued, plus reimbursement for the survey and the contractor delays. It was not a huge amount, but it covered my costs, and more importantly, it felt like justice. I framed the gate access logs and hung them in my office as a reminder that proof matters, and that standing up to abuse is worth the fight. Virginia moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. I heard she sold her house quietly and relocated to a different suburb outside Syracuse. I do not know what she does now, and I do not care. What I do know is that she left behind a trail of complaints, investigations, and policy changes that will make it much harder for anyone like her to operate unchecked in the future. The new board implemented term limits for all leadership positions, capped fine amounts, and required all enforcement actions to be reviewed by the management company before notices could be issued. They also established a resident advisory committee to provide input on rule changes and ensure that policies were applied fairly. The cottages at Willow Glen Reserve Association is not perfect, but it is better, and that is because residents refused to stay silent when they saw abuse. I still live in the same house, and I still share custody of my daughter. The fence I fought for is still standing, weathered now but solid, and it does exactly what I needed it to do. It marks the boundary of my property, keeps my yard private, and reminds me every time I see it that rules are only as fair as the people who enforce them. I learned a lot from this fight. I learned that keeping records is not paranoia, it is self-defense. I learned that standing up to authority is not easy, but it is necessary. And I learned that the people who scream the loudest about rules are often the ones breaking them the most. Virginia said I signed the covenants, and she was right. I did. But so did she, and in the end, the covenants held her accountable just like they were supposed to hold me. That is how it should work. That is how it finally does work. And that is why I will never stop fighting when I see someone abusing their power, because the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of standing up. The board meetings are quieter now. Stephen, the new enforcement coordinator, runs compliance checks on a published schedule and sends polite notices when issues arise. No more surprise inspections, no more gate lockouts, no more invented rules. The neighborhood email list is less chaotic, focused on real community issues like snow removal and street repairs instead of petty enforcement drama. I see my neighbors more often, and we talk about normal things like weather and sports and weekend plans. It feels like a community again, not a surveillance zone. Janet, the mail carrier, still waves when she delivers my mail, and she told me recently that she is glad she spoke up. She said she had been nervous about getting involved, but that seeing the outcome made her realize how important it is to support people who are being targeted. I told her I could not have done it without her, and I meant it. Allies matter, even when they are just one person with a witness statement. I also reconnected with Ed, the retired teacher who had to shave his porch railing down last year. Ed told me he had kept quiet about Virginia's harassment because he did not want to make things worse, but that after my hearing, he felt like he had permission to speak up. He filed a formal complaint about the railing incident and received a refund for the carpenter's work. Ed said it was not about the money, it was about the principle, and I understood exactly what he meant. The principle is that rules are supposed to protect everyone, not just the people in charge. The principle is that enforcement should be fair, transparent, and accountable. And the principle is that one person standing up can change the culture if they are willing to take the risk. The step stool is still there sometimes. I see it leaning against the entrance sign when I drive past, a reminder of Virginia's obsession with measuring and control. Someone left it there after the showdown, and no one has bothered to move it. It sits there like a monument to a failed reign, a collapsible throne for a coordinator who thought she could rule forever. I drive past it every day, and every time I see it, I smile. Because that step stool is not just a piece of equipment. It is a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked, and what happens when people decide they have had enough. Virginia used that step stool to intimidate, to enforce, to dominate. But in the end, it became her legacy, a dusty piece of metal that no one needs and no one wants. That is how I will always remember her. Not as a person, not as a neighbor, but as a warning. A warning that authority without accountability is just bullying with a clipboard. And a warning that the people who scream the loudest about covenants are often the ones who never bothered to read them. I finished my custody schedule this month without missing a single day. My daughter asks me sometimes why I spent so much time fighting the HOA, and I tell her it is because I wanted to make sure she knew that standing up for yourself matters. I tell her that rules are important, but fairness is more important, and that no one has the right to treat you badly just because they have a title or a clipboard. She nods, and I hope she remembers it when she is older. I hope she remembers that her dad did not back down, that he kept his records, that he stood his ground, and that he won. Not because he was smarter or stronger, but because he was willing to do the work, gather the proof, and call out the lies. That is the lesson I want her to take from this, and that is the lesson I hope anyone listening takes from this story. You do not have to be perfect. You just have to be persistent. And you have to be willing to say no when someone tries to silence you. Because the people who abuse power are counting on your silence. They are counting on you to give up, to pay the fine, to move on. And the moment you refuse, the moment you stand up and say this is not right, the whole system changes. It does not change overnight, and it does not change easily, but it changes. And that change is worth every fight, every hearing, every sleepless night, and every dollar spent on surveys and lawyers and proof. Because at the end of the day, you get to live in a place where the rules are fair, where your voice matters, and where no one can lock you out of your own home just because they do not like you. That is what I fought for. That is what I won. And that is why I will never regret it. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.